All right, so I want to talk today about religion. And the reason why is because I think it's an interesting topic, and it's one that I think has been gaining steam in the last couple of months, in that a bunch of the different podcasts that I watch have been having conversations about essentially that topic. It's been approached from a lot of different viewpoints, whether it's here's the history of religion, or the one I'm going to be looking at today is that of Tucker Carlson, which he had with Bret Weinstein. And that conversation is God versus atheism. And although I don't fall in the category of atheist, I fall more under the agnostic umbrella. I still think it's a very interesting conversation, and it's a good one to take a look at because you see both sides presented, and then I can give my opinion on each of their opinions therein. And just for very brief backstory of how I arrived at agnosticism, growing up, I had one set of grandparents that were not really religious at all, and then one set that were extremely religious. I never really figured out what denomination they were, but I'm pretty sure that they were like Jehovah's Witness or something, which is like, if you know anything about them, they're like super extreme. My father growing up never celebrated any holidays. So my dad actually was not religious. And then my mom decided that so my sister and I are both baptized as Catholics, and her basic mindset on it was, I don't know if this is actually real or not, but just to cover the bases, we're going to get them baptized. And I was baptized fairly later in life, if you will. It was when I was in middle school, I believe, either end of grade school or middle school, and so I had to take a bunch of the religion classes to be able to qualify, and then was going to church every Sunday as well. And for me, even when I was growing up, even when I was younger, I always kind of would question, big picture things like that. Like, I remember at one point in time, I'd asked my grandfather, how do you know that God exists? And he did not, it was the religious one, he did not like that question at all. And he kind of snapped at me and was like, well, if you don't believe, then I can't have that conversation. And it's like, okay, I'm a child at this point, but whatever. So I always kind of questioned it. And then we actually stopped going to church, and this is flashing forward to post my baptism, but we actually stopped going to church because I embarrassed my mom by falling asleep in church too much. Like basically every single weekend, during the sermon, I would fall asleep in the pews because it just was so, to me, boring. But then the funny thing is now that I am, a-religious, I guess if you would call it that, and then my sister actually is Christian. So it's just kind of funny how things all worked out, but that's kind of my backstory in a nutshell. So I just think it's something very interesting, and we'll kind of dive into my thoughts on it a little bit more as we review this interview/debate between Tucker and Bret.
Do not believe that there is a creator in the literal sense. I am in no way hostile to the idea, but I've come to the conclusion that there probably isn't such a creator, because all of the things that we have been able to figure out about the world, things that we know are true because they carry a great deal of predictive power, have come to us through the principle of parsimony. And I will clean up the principle of parsimony a little bit, because the way it was originally formulated is clumsy. But if we had access to all the information, then the simplest explanation for each pattern that we observe would be the correct one.
Right.
Simplicity is our guide to what's true. And for me, the problem with the hypothesis that there is a creator is that it answers one very difficult problem, where did the universe come from, at an expense that is vastly greater in terms of the assumptions, right? If the universe came from a creator, well, that simplifies one thing. But now we have to explain where that creator came from. And that's a much harder problem than explaining the universe itself. So as much as I agree, explaining the universe and explaining biology is difficult, it does not solve a problem to imagine that a creator is the answer. And even if there was one, well, maybe that creator was existing in a universe that was created by another creator, but eventually you're going to get to a place where you're going to have to reach for the only explanation we have ever come up with for where radical increases in complexity come from. So even if we, in this universe, are the product of a creator's work, ultimately that creator is going to have come from somewhere, and the only explanation that could possibly work is going to be Darwinian. So again, I'm not saying that I know whether there is or there isn't, but I am saying that the principle that has allowed us to see all of what we can see, that has allowed us to build all that we have built, that principle is parsimony, and it suggests that this universe is not the product of an intentional creation.
And that is a very strong argument, in my opinion, because if you think about it, and this is kind of one of there's multiple issues that I've had with it, right? But that's kind of one of my main issues with it, is that where did God come from? Why did he wait until XYZ time to create humans? Because I think even, there are some religious fundamentalists that are saying, dinosaurs are fake and whatever, which is kind of insane to me. But looking at the preponderance of evidence, if you look back through time and you say, okay, yes, dinosaurs were real and this, that, and the other, then why did God create dinosaurs? Like, how did God end up, if he created us in his image, why did he create us at XYZ point in time, right, when we actually came about? So to me, that was always kind of confusing, right? Is that if there is just one God, that it has been around, even if you just say forever, how did we end up with the timeline that we did? Like, why was the Earth around so long before he decided to create humans? And specifically to this argument, where did God come from? There's really no answer to that, in my opinion, or at least that I've heard. Not that I've had in-depth conversations about this, but again, the timeline just doesn't really add up for me, and there's no explanation of what was God doing all this time. Has God been around forever? What was God doing before the earth was even created, assuming that he has been around forever? There are just too many question marks with the idea that there is a God, and for me, for that to basically be foolproof, you would have to take a look at it and say, the earth has been around forever, humans have been around forever, it literally, God just created everything. And I think that's the other issue I have with it too, is in that timeline, just as I'm speaking through it, it's right at the beginning of the Bible, you're saying, okay, everything was created in 7 days. And it's like, okay, but where's to the dinosaurs, where do the dinosaurs fit in that? Because there is a long span of time where dinosaurs were around, where humans were not. And so if you look at that span of time, how does that fit into the 7 days? Like, it just doesn't really make any sense. And even if you're being generous in your time frame and you're saying, oh yeah, that was like day 4 or whatever, however you want to piece that together, it still doesn't add up, in my opinion. It just doesn't, the math isn't mathing, if that makes sense.
The Hebrews explained it this way, and the Christians too, that the process is inherent in the description. So the creator is the force that creates and is not himself created. So in other words, God was not created. God has always been there, period.
Right. And I see, you can make the question go away.
And again, that's where I kind of put the cart before the horse. That's literally me answering Tucker's basically premise there, is that, like I said, the timeline just isn't adding up then. Like, what was he doing before? Why did he wait so long to create us if we're the ultimate goal of his creation? You know, why was the Earth not formed earlier? Why are dinosaurs not accounted for in that timeline? Why, when the Earth came about, were we not created immediately? Again, just the timeline doesn't add up for there to be an ultimate creator that could create anything with the snap of a finger. And I think Tucker's more on the fundamentalist side, where like he truly believes like just humans sprung up from God's creation. But there are, I think there are a subset of people who believe in religion who believe that God used evolution, and I think that's a much stronger argument. But yeah, the whole timeline thing just kind of that's always a question mark for me when you're talking to someone who believes in the fundamentalist idea that God just created us out of nothing. At that point, it's like, okay, then why was there so much lag time that we're seeing? And I just have never seen that explained.
But I don't know what that means. We don't have any example of such a thing. So
no, we definitely don't, because everything apart from God is created.
Well, okay, let me take a different tack.
Yes.
Let's just start from the premise that there is a creator who intended this universe and the biota. So I'm a product of that,
right,
in this thought experiment. And in such a case, I know that this creator gave me a capacity to reason. I'm pretty good at it, and that's why I've invested in it professionally. And he gave me an incredible set of evidence for Darwinian evolution. And I'm now forced to grapple with the question of why a creator would have given me a capacity to reason, would have given me the principle of parsimony, the power of which I can see, and a set of evidence that forces me to conclude that the biota at least evolved in a Darwinian way. Now, it could be, let's put it this way. I think the simplest explanation then would be that the creator used evolution to make the biology. And that, maybe the creator is especially interested in the products of a Darwinian process. Maybe the creator is as delighted as I am, or because he's the creator, more delighted than I am at the sight of a hummingbird, that's a marvelous thing to have happened through this process. I could imagine that. It still doesn't strike me as the simplest way to explain the universe that I see, but...
And that's, again, kind of going back to the, those who are religious that believe that God used evolution to create, that is where, this argument kind of makes sense, right? Where you're saying, okay, because, and exactly to Bret's point here, is that you're going through it and you're saying, if you look at the fossil records, if you look at even species that are alive right now that have variances, and you say, oh yeah, this arrived because of this evolutionary advantage in this area. I think a really good example of it is actually in the Grand Canyon, right? You have this huge gash in the earth that's separating these two land masses that used to be connected. And there are squirrels, there's two squirrels that are basically descendant from the same squirrels, but because one has been evolving on the north side and one has been evolving on the south side, they come up with two completely, they branched and now they look different and they have different actions, and so they're not the same squirrel anymore. And when you're looking at that, that to me is an argument for exactly what he's saying, where it's like, look, you can see this evolution around everywhere. So that's why I think again, the religious fundamentalism, where you're saying, oh no, like God just created humans, not through evolution. You just plopped us down here. That doesn't make any sense to me. So, when you're seeing these minor differences through evolution and evolutionary biology, there's no other way to really explain that other than evolutionary biology exists. So whether God chooses to use that or not, again, I think it points more towards, if there is a God, he probably used that method, not just creating things and letting them, go from his creation.
If a creator wanted a universe in which biological marvels happened, then the universe might look like this. And it doesn't change what I do. At the point that I know that a Darwinian process is actually the tool that has shaped the creatures, then it makes sense to study it in the way that I do. So, again, I'm not against the idea that there's a creator. I don't see any evidence for it. If there is a creator, I'm pretty sure he must want me to be skeptical for some reason, because he's given me that which would cause me to be skeptical. And I guess the final piece of that argument is that I think that there is a more parsimonious way to understand our universe and the role of religious belief in it, which I know will be grating to many people, especially people who do have a profound relationship with a religious faith. But I think the right way to understand all of the evidence is that religious belief systems are themselves profoundly important products of evolution. They are keys to the amazing capacity of humans. And so I don't know how clear this is, but part of what I'm saying is that I think the facts tell us, or they strongly imply, a story in which there is no literal creator, but they do not tell us that the creator is a fiction, right? Any more than a wing is a fiction. Our belief in God or gods is a key to human functionality, and it is incumbent on evolutionary biologists to understand in what way that could possibly be true. And this is a responsibility on which I think evolutionists have fallen down. They have treated religious devotion as, frankly, a pathology, and it couldn't possibly be one. It's obviously adaptive. And because it's obviously adaptive, it requires the same seriousness that we point at other structures or processes. And so far, there's been very little of that in my field.
I don't think it is adaptive. I don't think there's any evidence of that at all. And I should also say that, by the way, and I'll tell you why I think that, but I should say what I said on Rogan was like characteristically inarticulate and imprecise. And I don't have a problem at all with the idea that there's physical evolution, because I think there clearly is. My problem is with the question of the creation of all things. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's a better explanation or a more reasonable explanation that there's just a God that created everything. If you disagree, I'd love to hear it. But let me just say, of the question of religion being adaptive, so like one of the main modes of religious expression from the beginning of recorded history is human sacrifice, including, and it still goes on today around the world in various forms. And the idea that that's like necessary because population outstrips resources is not always true. There are tons of examples, including in modern day, lots of places, including the United States, where there's plenty of resources and people do it anyway. But it's the same story in every civilization, none of which could have had contact with each other that we know of. And there's kind of nothing that evolutionary biology can say about that. It's like it's not helping people at all, and they're doing it anyway.
So, specifically to Tucker's example, well, my belief is that religion is a way for people to explain things that are either questions that are too large to grapple with. Well, there's a couple reasons. So number one is, like I just said, to explain things that are too large to grapple with. Like, if something awful happens to you, it is very convenient for people to, and you see this especially today, in today's world, where people want to externalize anything that happens to them. And it's very convenient to be able to say, no, yes, something awful happened to me, but it's not my fault. It's God testing me. So that's number one. Number two is that it is a way to exert control. And I think this has been proven time and time again. If you have a group of people and you want them to do something without having to pay them, you basically indoctrinate them to believe a certain set of beliefs and demonize. Hey, and I'm not saying this is definitely not for every religion, so I want to make that disclaimer right now. But multiple times throughout, like, religious crusades and that kind of a thing, it's where you say, okay, we're indoctrinating this population and we're going to go take over those people over there because they believe in a different God and that God is a false God, and we need to bring our religion to them. And that's a way to, get your civilization or your group to have that kind of mindset where, just look at the Middle East now. They're constantly infighting and religious violence against each other, constantly suicide bombers, all because one sect doesn't believe in what another one is doing. And that's why that whole region is such a, insane place, in my opinion, when it comes to, religious zealotry. So that is the second, is as a motivating force to get people to, engage in warfare or whatever, without, again, having to levy huge costs upon the leadership to have them go do that. And the third, and this is the one I'm the most sympathetic to, is one time I was actually having a conversation with my sister, and like I said on the outset, my sister is religious, I am not. And the conversation that I had with her is, I was like, why, how did you end up believing in, being a Christian? Because that's what she is now. And her response was, it is a good way to have a set of morals that you can live by. And that was why she decided to end up being religious, which I again, this is the one that I am the most sympathetic to, whereby if you need religion as a set of guidelines and or to hold yourself accountable to live a moral life, then I think that is a very good thing for you. And that's why I'm not combative or dismissive or look down upon people who are religious, is because, again, if you have that mindset that this is what I need to live a moral life and do good in the world, then by all means, because I think that makes it a better world. And hats off to you for wanting to do the right thing, and great, perfect for you. So again, those are the three things where I think, biologically speaking, yes, those evolved out of the need for humans, right? Those were necessary things as either, motivators or, keeping people in line or, whatever it is to help further, right? Because each one of those things furthers your colony for the future, right? Because if you're all immoral and you're all going out and murdering and stealing each other's wives and doing this and that, like, that's not it's gonna be infighting, and then everyone's gonna split and go their different ways, and you're not gonna have a communal group to conquer your surroundings, right? That's what a society is based on, is a big group of people who overcome nature. Going out and conquering other hostile, these are all things that biologically are necessary for humans. So I think evolve in that way that would be beneficial biologically?
Well, I look at it differently. I mean,
Okay.
I see the same or a similar pattern. And my sense is in biology, when we see a complex, costly pattern that either re-evolves, spreads, or otherwise persists over a long period of time, we are forced to grapple with the question of what could its utility be.
Exactly.
And while I don't think we have a good hypothesis about the utility of human sacrifice, and personally, morally, I'm offended by it, as I'm
Me
sure
too.
you are.
So is God, by the way.
Nonetheless, like so many of humanity's worst attributes, we have to look at it and grapple with the evolutionary implications, that it does have some sort of a meaning. And
specifically to the human sacrifice component of it, that's the same thing where it's I would say that falls into that first bucket that I listed of externalizing something bad happening. And it's not that it is the singular person's fault, right? Because if you think about, like, you know, the Aztecs or whoever, right, throughout time that have done ritualistic sacrifices, it's that they're saying something bad is happening. We don't know what to blame it on. So we're going to say it's the gods punishing us, and the only way to overcome that is by killing someone, basically, sacrificing someone. And so, again, that's the externalizing of there is someone punishing us. It's not just bad luck. It's not just, you know, this is happening for a reason. Not, okay, well, we settled in an awful place and we just need to move somewhere else. No, this is happening for a reason, and we need to, this is our solution on how to fix it. So, again, it falls into that first bucket of externalizing negative effects that you are experiencing.
I should say, buried within what I'm saying is a critique of where my field has gotten to. As I think I mentioned to you in a past discussion, I think my field is stuck.
Yeah.
And it's no longer solving big problems. It's focused on producing lots of papers that study some specific, but it's not discovering big new things. And that's not because there isn't lots to be done. It's because it's sort of lost track of how to do it. So I'm not arguing, I'm not a champion of the state of evolutionary biology. I think it's a little it's pitiful. But I am a champion of the basic Darwinian paradigm, which I think we have lost sight of. In fact, evolutionary biologists in the middle of the 20th century overly narrowed our understanding of Darwinism and have blinded us to what it's really trying to tell us about ourselves. And I would love to see us remember how to do the process of discovery and to start,
I strongly agree,
unlocking big puzzles. But it sounds to me like you believe in a universe in which biological evolution happens.
Yes.
Okay, so there's no disagreement.
And that people adapt, and that human behavior is to a huge extent a function of physical reality, of biology. And like, we do certain things, we have certain attitudes because of biology, because of nature. Like, these are imperatives of nature. And so I totally buy all that. I think Darwin thought all that. Here's, I guess, to put a finer point on it, I believe in the existence of the supernatural. I've experienced it, I've seen it, it's real, it exists outside of nature, outside of all the laws that we think we're subject to, and it acts on us. And human sacrifice is one example of that. So that's my view. I'm totally convinced that that's true. I know that it's true. And so I don't know if there's room in the framework that you're describing for that fact.
Well,
and I think this is kind of interesting. I'd like to have him dive a bit deeper on that. But the point of supernatural, that's actually one of the reasons that I always had a difficult time getting on board with religion, if you will, is because there are all these fantastic things that supposedly happened in the Bible. And to me, I don't know about you, but in my everyday life, I've never seen anyone part a sea outside of forest fires. I've never seen a burning bush, or man-made fire or whatever. There are all these things that happen within the Bible where I just go, put up or shut up, I guess, would be the best way to say it, which is kind of crass. But point remains that there are all these fantastic things, turning water into wine, all these things that happen in the Bible. And yes, some of them were created by Jesus and so therefore by God, and blah, blah, blah. But no one's done this. Again, if you wanted to prove it, just show up and create it, or have him come back, or there's have miracles happen, or yes, there might be things that have happened that are supernatural, as Tucker says, but I think those are more easily explained. Anything that has been amazing that I have seen can be easily explained, or is just a chance of luck, or it's not something that is crazy, and as outlandish as some of the things that are claimed to have happened in the Bible. So that was one of my issues, and that was kind of, I think, especially when I was a child or a young adult, some of the reasons and issues that I had with believing in the story of Jesus and basically everything in the Bible.
What I think I did not articulate properly is I'm not arguing that a materialist scientific worldview that excludes the supernatural is a better way to live. One of the things I think atheists have done particularly badly, and one of the reasons that I don't call myself an atheist, is that there is no demonstrated case in which, an atheist civilization has thrived. In fact, we have many examples in which they have spectacularly collapsed. And in fact, the things that presently threaten our civilization include a great many, atheist ideas, like, you can just up and change your sex if you feel that you're trapped in the wrong body.
There is no God but us.
Right. So
I'm not a huge fan of that argument, mostly because I wouldn't ascribe that to atheism. I mean, I guess you could. It'd be hard for me to say because, again, I fall in the agnostic camp. But again, this kind of points to my earlier example of, yes, but that's a learned biological benefit of having a religion is holding people to a set of morals. And that's what he's saying here, is just kind of proving that point. So again, yes, if I think if it's needed, then by all means, I think it's great for anyone who needs it. So that's why I'm not trying to say no one should believe in religion. If it helps you, it helps you. But this is just, again, explaining why, in my opinion, I don't particularly believe in it.
So that program doesn't work very well, at least not as far as we've seen.
I think that's true.
So I'm not arguing that a belief...
No, but I'm not even... No, I know that you think that, and it's obvious in how you live that you think that. But I want to get more focused on just like the reality of it. Like if there is no supernatural, then like what is all this stuff?
Well...
like what's the other explanation?
So I will tell you...
And I want him to dive deeper into that. Like, please explain what you mean by supernatural. Because I do think that there are some things that have happened to me in my life. Like, very interestingly, in my history, especially as I've paid attention to it, I would say I became more aware of it as I came out, or as I was in college and coming out of it. But there's been very interesting timelines for things that have happened to me where, like I was basically within one paycheck of having a storage unit get repossessed. Like if I didn't make a certain amount of money at a certain time, all my credit cards were maxed. I literally couldn't afford anything else coming out of college. because I had put summer school on a credit card, which is an awful idea. And so it was basically just decisions like that, or things that happen like that, or I lost a job, and then things were really, really, really tight, and then I just happened to get one really fast right afterwards, and it worked out, and I was making more money, and then things, became better. And so, but there, especially around that time, but there's been other examples of that going through where things have just worked out too perfectly that, yes, you could say it was a supernatural, something was happening, some supernatural force made things align for me in my life where things have worked out, and now today I'm in a great place. So again, I would like to hear what his examples are of supernatural, because the other thing that I would say about that is that could be ascribed to anything. I mean, that could be dumb luck, but then the other thing that I think about, and this will be a bit of a tangent, but I think the best way I've heard it described is that, so as you increase the number of gods, right? So say one god is less, so the fact that there's no God, and I thought this is actually really interesting. The fact that there's no God and that all of this just appeared out of pure chance is less likely than that there is one God. And then the likelihood that there is one God who created everything by him or herself, itself, is less likely than there are multiple gods. Because then, there could be like one God that created the pantheon of God. Like, think about it as like Greek mythology. Creates a pantheon of gods. Each god is responsible for a certain thing. Because that was another issue that I had with monotheism in general, or that there's only one God, is that how is God able to oversee every single thing? Like, if you think about you in your life, how many decisions in a day are you making? And how many things where you think God has made an impact in your life or changed something for the positive? Now multiply that by 8 billion if you believe that, God watches over everyone. And so this was one that, I had thought of just when I was out driving one day, where I was looking at all the cars around, and I go, every single person around me, every single car has at least one person in it who is having the exact same experience of life as me, which is like mind-blowing, because then you go, now imagine that for every single house, every single business, there's so many people out there, and all of them are having a unique experience. And so the fact that one God is overseeing all of that is less likely than, again, that there's, maybe a God at the top, and there, it's distributed through other gods who watch over certain things. So it's just less likely that there's monotheism than polytheism, which is multiple gods. And then it's even less, so that is less likely than, because in this explaining, it was basically they believe in the simulation hypothesis. So it's even less likely than, so polytheism is less likely than that it's a simulation. That basically there's something out there, and if you assume that technology gets better and better and better, then at some point they create something where it's like the Matrix, right? Or like if you play video games, think about regular Nintendo to, PS5 now, or whatever. Like just the graphics, the evolution of graphics is insane. And if that trajectory continues, then at some point in time, if you're saying the universe is billions of years old, it's more likely still that someone has hit that in the past, that curve where, okay, now they can create a reality, a virtual reality that is indistinguishable from reality. And, the computing and all that continues to grow up to the level where you could simulate an entire universe from a single person. So any one person in that, that civilization or whatever, given enough technology and time, eventually would be able to simulate their own universes. And in that scenario, then the overwhelming likelihood is that we are actually in a simulation, because if there's even 1,000 people in this civilization, just imagine, and again, we're talking the world, we're talking 8 billion, and we're going to use a much smaller number. But if there's 1,000 chances for an entire universe to be simulated, or even just the Earth, and everything else out there is so far away that it doesn't really matter, whatever. However you want to frame this. But the likelihood that that has happened, given the billions of years that or forever that the universe has been around, it is way more likely that that is possible than polytheism, and polytheism is much more likely than monotheism, which is much more likely than everything just arose out of chance, which I thought was a pretty compelling argument. It's very interesting, and again, it's kind of abstract, but to my point about this is that when you're looking at that scale, that I don't even think monotheism is the most possible, which is why I say I'm agnostic. I think any of those things could be true, but that was the most compelling thing I have heard, that all of this arising out of chance is the least likely, from one creator, less, more, up to poly, and then the most that the entire thing is a simulation. And again, that's kind of a tangent on the point, but I thought it was a very interesting argument that kind of fits in well here.
How I deal with the question personally.
Yes.
Which is, I have a category that I don't share with anybody as far as I know, that I would call the metanatural, right? Which is sort of the advantage that comes from believing in the supernatural. I believe it all ultimately could be explained through a natural system, in the same way you could explain a baseball game by thinking of all of the atoms in the baseball and the bat and the players. But that's a terrible way to think about baseball, right? It just doesn't, it's not functional. But yes, you could in principle do it. So I think that the belief in the supernatural is a much more efficient way of encoding hidden truths that you can't readily comprehend. So to give you one example, you might have a system in which you imagine that the misbehavior of your people, whoever they might be, is going to result in the anger of a God who will punish you with famine.
Right.
Okay, that would be supernatural. It's also true that if your people are busy betraying each other, that may threaten the harvest. In other words, your coordination in the planting of crops, the protecting of those crops, and the harvesting of those crops is dependent on whether or not people like and trust each other. And to the extent that they're backstabbing each other, it could very well result in starvation without the intervention of an intentional God. So to me, those two stories are the same story. How do you explain to people you really shouldn't misbehave because it could interfere with our coordination in a way that may result in us not having enough food to get through the winter? The answer is, God sees what you're doing, and he's not happy about it. And when God's not happy, starvation is highly likely, right? So the metanatural is the category that allows the reconciliation of the efficient narrative description of this process with the difficult to spot deeper physical connection.
I think that's, I think there's a practical effect of doing the right thing, and it's a good thing, right?
Right.
Right. So, but I'm more interested in the question, among others, of like knowing. How do we know things on the basis of no evidence that are true? How do we know?
Well,
but we do know. So that's kind of my point, is that very often the deepest truths come to us apart from, outside of our senses. And we're right.
Well, I wouldn't say outside of our senses.
And to answer Tucker's question there, is I would say two things. Either one, it is evolutionarily beneficial. That would be number one, is that it's something that it's like ingrained. Like, think about your dog, right? Or your cat, or whatever animal you have. There are certain things that they do that make no sense to us living in a house. Like, they're safe, they're whatever. Think about when they go to bed and, you have a dog and they circle around and look all around before they lay down. What is that? Well, that's something that has been ingrained in them evolutionarily. It's been an evolutionary benefit that even though right now it is not necessary, it's still something that is residing deep inside them. So that could be number one as an answer to his question, is that it's something that we as humans have learned. Think about something that's common even for us, where it's like, oh, we're afraid of the dark. Why? Because at nighttime, that's when we're most vulnerable. We don't have good night vision, compared to other animals like cats or whatever. That was a very dangerous thing for us. So more people are afraid of the dark than, it's just a very common thing to happen. So again, that I think is evolutionary. And then the other part of it is, you may not remember now, but it could be something that is ingrained inside of you. So say when you were growing up, your parents, A, it's observations from as you were growing up and you learn things, but then B, it's how your parents taught you. And I think that explains, again, how you may not be able to necessarily attribute it to, yes, every time my mom taught me I needed to share and I couldn't just take things from people. But again, it's something that's taught to you either through parenting or experiences or community, or it's things that have been reinforced all throughout your life that you may not understand that was the lesson at the time. But when it's time for you to recall and to behave in a certain way, those are things that will influence your decision making, but you may not be able to actually subscribe it to a certain experience or something like that, essentially.
I would say outside of our consciousness.
Okay.
And so the distinction is like this. Our consciousness is late evolving. It shows up at the end of our evolutionary story, not early. And, that means that there are a good many mammals that have some degree of consciousness that we can see, but nobody's conscious like we are.
I don't know that I fully believe that. I think some animals might just be disadvantaged in the way that they are able to communicate in the tools that they have. And I think that this viewpoint is one where we're setting ourselves up on a pedestal. And I think it's basically we're full of ourselves to think that nothing else comes close to us. So I don't actually believe in his theory on this, because if you look at many animals, but if you think about like dolphins, right? They have complex family groups, they have, there'll be pods of them, they communicate, they play, they will ingest toxins to essentially get high, like from a puffer fish. So there are many things where, yes, okay, we might not view it as being as complex as what we're doing, right? They don't build cities, but then again, they don't have the tools. They don't have hands. They don't, they're not able to manipulate their surroundings the same way that we do. But then to denigrate their experience as being lesser than ours is, I think, incredibly demeaning and very chauvinistic as well. To think that, we're the only ones that our experience is so much different, when it may just be that other creatures are not able to manifest their experience the same way that we are.
Conscious mind, I will argue, is actually evolved for an initial purpose. The initial purpose is exactly what we are doing right now. It is the ability for two minds to pool their understanding, right? To actually plug into each other and reach an emergent conclusion that neither of us could reach alone, or that the two of us couldn't reach separately if we could.
Also, the other thing that he said that I don't totally agree with is that how do we know that consciousness emerged recently? How do we know that it wasn't available? Because I have a theory where, kind of like AI now, and this is something that I think has been very interesting to think about, is that how do we know that our consciousness does not arrive from an accumulation of data, much like AI now, right? And this is kind of my argument for AI, is how do we know it's not a conscious being? Because maybe all consciousness is a collection of information, in that we, if you think about during the human history, and I think he's making a good point here, which is why I'm addressing it now after he made this point about being able to interface, is that we become more conscious as we are able to obtain more information, which is enabled by being able to share, writing, printing, the internet. So we gain more and more consciousness, if you will, through being able to learn things, being able to pass things on. So now our children have consciousness, but it may have always been latent, but you could only be so conscious because you're struggling for, fighting for resources, or you have to have just natural reactions to things in nature which serve you better than intelligence would, or being able to have different paths of thought where just you have to react so fast. And so in that instance, and again, it's an interesting thought exercise as I've thought about more AI and is it conscious, is that maybe consciousness is only a function of data accumulation, if you will. So again, I kind of I'm not certain that I 100% agree with his positing of consciousness is recent. It could have been around when humans first emerged in their modern form as Homo sapiens, but it may not have been the case that it has been fully actualized and realized until more recently. But it could have been something that was there. And again, same thing with like dolphins in my previous example, is that they may be, have the same level of consciousness, if you will, but they're not able to learn as much because they can't pass on that information and learn and build on and that kind of a thing. Again, just something interesting to think of, but that's why, his point of, consciousness is more recent. I'm not sure that I'm fully bought into that.
Couldn't plug our consciousnesses into each other. So when we say, actually, that we know things, but we don't know how we know them, we're sort of talking about our conscious minds, which is just this thin sliver on top of this architecture that has been knowing things for millions of years in ways that weren't conscious at all. So I think it's that interface. Does my conscious mind know why I know this to be true? Why do I meet somebody and have a distrust that turns out to be accurate with respect to their trustworthiness, right? I can try to piece it together. I may get nowhere. And it may be that there's a lot that I actually did perceive. It came in through my eyes and my ears and who knows what else. But it is my conscious mind's difficulty in describing it that feels like my entire mind was handed this piece of information. So, to put it another way, we don't do a good job of talking about intuition. In my opinion, intuition is the product of unconscious processes in the mind. If those unconscious processes are in a zone where you've had a lot of experience, your intuition is liable to be excellent. If those unconscious processes are trying to navigate something where you don't have much experience at all, your intuition will be crude. It's not a supernatural process. It's about the sum total of your experiences and what they are capable of putting together about the world. And that, to me, it might as well be supernatural from the point of view of how most people live their lives. It may indeed just simply be the best way to function. But that's different than saying that that's actually what's taking place.
Do people ever communicate with each other across distances non-verbally?
Yeah. In fact, one of the funny things about us is that we have a special adaptation in our eyes that allows us to communicate as a hunting party without alerting the thing that we're hunting.
No, I mean out of sight.
Sure.
I'm 500 miles from my spouse, and we have the same thought at the same moment.
And this is where I think he's trying to point to like the whole telepathy thing, which is interesting. But yeah, it's fun. It's funny that Bret's trying to look at it from an evolutionary. Oh yeah, how do we, what adaptations have we had through biology that, okay, yes, a hunting party, we can, motion without making sound. But Tucker is going to more like full on supernatural. So I think this is diving into more maybe what he was kind of referring to with supernatural occurrences, which is interesting. So we'll take a look here.
Yeah. But I don't think it's supernatural.
How is that natural?
Well, I mean, if I work backwards from my own parallel experiences, my wife and I know each other very, very well. She can detect if my pattern of communication is off. And, if she is triggered to think, I would have expected to hear from him, I didn't. I wonder what that's about. She also knows a certain amount about, what's been on my mind and, where I may be heading. And therefore she may be able to deduce, because she, if we're talking about intuition, Heather's intuition about me has got to be pretty damn good, because she's had, her entire adult life to build a model that's as accurate as anybody's would be. So her ability to figure out that that there is some pattern there is second to none, and it will not surprise me if very frequently she nails the analysis and we can be 500 miles or 1,000 miles apart, and it feels like a communication across a very long distance, when really it's a kind of a synchrony that allows her to extrapolate when something has departed from normal. And I will say one other thing about this. We have a very strange pattern as human beings. When we meet, we say totally meaningless things. What's new? Not much, right? And I've thought a lot about why that would be. It's not very expensive each time we do it, but over a lifetime, you're putting a lot of effort into using a communication mechanism that can transmit very remarkable stuff, and you're just broadcasting empty stuff.
A lot of wasted breath, yeah.
Except it's not wasted. If I come through the door and I say, hey, honey, I know before I even see Heather what frame of mind she's in based on her response, even though the words may be the same always. I can tell if she's frustrated, if she's elated. I know what frame of mind she's in. And my sense is that it makes sense when we meet somebody to go through a pro forma interaction that allows you to detect things like emotional state, right? It's a profoundly important check. And rather than say something special, to the degree that it is standardized what those interactions contain, it makes it much easier to detect the part that's important, which is the tone, the cadence, all of those things. So,
how was your day? Fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So anyway,
Can I just bring back to the beginning, though?
Sure.
If you said that the principle of parsimony.
And just before we depart off of this, because I think that there are some some interesting points to kind of tease out here. I think where Tucker was probably going with it, and Bret kind of diffused it, is like when you think about someone you haven't talked to in a long time and then they call, right? Like those kind of experiences where you're mutually thinking about each other and you're just like, oh, like I think that's where Tucker was going with it, and Bret kind of reduced it down to familiarity, which doesn't actually answer that question or that supernatural occurrence, if you will. And so my thought on it is that there may have been some sort of what we would view today as supernatural ability. Think telekinesis or something. Like at some point in time, we were able to move things with our mind. Or I, for a while, was having dreams, and this is back quite a few years, but where I would be able to fly, like super jump, basically. Like I would jump and be able to fly long distances by thinking about, like, basically using my mind to carry myself. So who's to say that at some point in time we didn't have all these extra abilities, like, being able to connect with someone intellectually through telekinesis, or or move things with our mind. Like if you're thinking about in the instance of the pyramid, like maybe people were able to, or super strength, right? If you don't want to believe that our minds were able to manipulate things in the physical world, maybe we had super strength back then, that it made it much more realistic that people were able to move things like large blocks of stone through extra strength, that over time, as we have created cities and been able to rely on each other more, that there are senses that have not dulled from us not needing to exercise them for survival of our species. So I find it very interesting that Bret is dismissive of there being what we would view again today as supernatural abilities, but maybe there was something in our past that allowed us to overcome, basically being one of the weakest animals in the animal kingdom, right? We attribute our evolution to intelligence, but once we hit a certain level where we are at the top of, the apex predators, and essentially nothing is a threat to us anymore, well, then we lose capabilities with each generation of humans that we may have previously had, because they're no longer necessary. And you can see this as a very readily, certain things like that would be very hard to see in a fossil record. But if you think about even things like the gallbladder, stuff like that, or wisdom teeth, things that in the past were necessary for us to survive, but today are no longer required, and they have reduced in function, and at a certain point are not even necessary to survive anymore. Like you can have your gallbladder removed and there's not really a huge impact that you would have on your daily life. And so again, and everyone gets wisdom teeth extracted now, right? So there are things that were functional in our history but are no longer necessary. And I think those things are very interesting, because that's a perfect example of how there could have been something that was, and I'm not strongly, it's so hard to take the agnostic approach, right? It's very hard to say that, yes, this was the case, that we did have these things that we were capable of doing in the history, and now there's just no real examples of it. But it's an interesting thought experiment to say, hey, maybe these things were around. We can see already examples of things that have decayed or are useless to us in today's world where they were around for our ancestors. So just, again, something to think of that I think is interesting to kind of insert in the supernatural conversation. And again, certainly you see things like the pyramid where, by today's standard would be almost impossible to erect, especially given the time frames that were given for it to be constructed. So why wouldn't that lend itself to a supernatural explanation?
It's usually true. Like the simplest explanation is the likely explanation. So my explanation for the creation of all things is God, who is not created but only creates, created all things. Pretty simple. Your explanation is what?
Well, let's put it this way. I've seen another version of this where you won't expect it. The many universes theory of quantum mechanics.
Yep.
You know this?
Yep.
So the basics are that in order to reconcile some of the oddities that quantum mechanics has discovered, we imagine that in every instant there is a universe spawned for every conceivable outgrowth. And so, you know, if I pick up this pen, there's a universe in which I didn't and a universe in which I did. Right. And those universes go on to do whatever they do, right? This is a spectacularly simple explanation linguistically. It is the opposite of simple in terms of what it implies. You're going to create a universe for every conceivable nuance of interaction that every creature, every pebble that rolled down a hill. You're creating universes at this rate. That's not simple. That's complex at a level that's beyond extreme. And so my sense, and you know, again, I'm not arguing that this isn't the better way to live, but my sense is when you say the simplest explanation is a creator who wasn't created.
And the other thing about that point that he was just making is it's not just I pick up the pen or I didn't, but then there's also I threw the pen, I ate the pen, I stuck the pen in the wall. There's so many different outcomes that you could have done with each action that, yeah, the cascading effects of that, and to his point, which I think is a really good one too, is it's not just for you, it's for every living thing. And even if you want to slim it down to just people, right, if that's your viewpoint, then yeah, there's 8 billion times 8 billion times every single second when you're choosing to do something or not, or you know, every single decision that you could make therein. Yeah, that one just spirals completely out of control and doesn't make much sense to me.
Yeah, linguistically, that it doesn't get simpler than that. It's a one sentence, you know, and you're done. At the level of what it means, it's almost inconceivably. What does it mean for something capable of creating a universe not to have come into existence?
Right.
Right? I can't even imagine what that means, right?
Well, it is inconceivable. I mean, that's why you're the created, not the creator.
Right. But, and again, I'm not hostile to this position.
No, I don't think you are. That's why.
But my point would be, the question of did the universe start with a creator is not one that you are likely to derive some practical value from spending your time on. In fact, you could waste your entire life, make no progress, and be detained from all of the other things you might have done. So it would be useful for most humans throughout most of history to have had a simple explanation that simply allowed them to move on to questions where there was some profit to be made or peril to be avoided, right? You want not to be stuck on questions where there's no potential value in your exploration.
And that is kind of interesting as well, because in that he is saying the universe arose from a creator, and we're talking about the simplest explanation. Even simpler than that is that just the universe has existed forever, in that it just goes on and on and on. That seems more common sense to me than that it just sprung up out of nothing. You know, there's someone that we can't explain, and then they created everything else. That explanation makes so much less sense than that the universe has just existed forever, continues to go on and on and on, and there's a cycle where, you know, in our galaxy, yes, there's life, eventually it will become extinguished, and then the Earth will blow up, and some cells will make it to another Earth-like planet, and then life will spring up there, and it's just another cycle where it just keeps going on and on and on, and it just perpetuates itself, right? And so that explanation to me makes so much more sense than trying to say that there's a creator that made the universe up out of nothing.
And so my sense is that that's a very elegant way of moving on to things that are actually important. And that's why it's effectively an enduring answer to a question that every human being is likely to have at some point.
So what's the other explanation?
I don't know. I mean, where'd the universe come from? I'm not even sure we can know.
Well, that's the religious position too.
Right. Well, and that's part of why I wanted to talk to you about this is I do think that there will ultimately be a distinction between people who are...
And the other interesting thing about that is, again, that falls into the bucket of how do we explain things that are unexplainable, is that people strive for meaning in the world, and so we come up with, oh, well, God made the universe. And instead of the inconvenient actual explanation, in my opinion, where it's just the universe has been around forever. It just through a happenstance that we're here, and now we're struggling to understand the scope and the reason and the meaning in your life. And that's how we end up with creating a creator, is to explain all of that.
Faith first and people who are parsimony first. And the distinction is the ordering of two things, right? Did God create an evolving universe, or did an evolving universe create God? It's one or the other. But my feeling is it's nothing beyond that. We should be able to actually productively collaborate on everything else. And then, at some point in the evening, we can have that argument.
So here's I guess the other kind of thematic problem I have with thinking about everything in terms of evolution is that I don't think people are evolving.
Oh,
human behavior. I mean, look, the written record doesn't go very far. The first legal code we have is Hammurabi's code, just a few thousand years old, but it's still a while.
Yep.
And a lot has happened in the ensuing thousands of years, and that's totally recognizable as a legal code to anyone who reads it.
Yep.
And people are just kind of the same as they have always been, to the extent that we know how they have been. Right.
Just to jump out in front of Bret on this one, I aggressively disagree with that. I think even if you look at modern culture, I would almost say it's de-evolving. So it's not evolve, right? And that's going to be a hard pill for people to swallow. But even if you look up presidential speeches or congressional speeches or Senate speech, look at any speeches from politicians in the 1950s or whenever, any previous time period that you want, and then fast forward to Donald Trump today. And I think it's very instructive that you see a dumbing down of rhetoric to meet people at where they are today. And I think, again, a huge portion of that is because of, I think it's two things. Number one, it's that there's no natural selection. And I didn't call it exactly that, but it's much less necessary for you to have skills to survive out in the wild, because we've conquered that and we created cities and everything is safe. So what happens is weaker, less mentally sound people are able to survive and procreate, and then their offspring can survive more and more with less and less skills required. So we're weaker, we're less intelligent, and these are all things that, again, that's why, people are so amused with what Donald Trump is saying, is because they don't want to think deeply about things, and they don't want to have, it hurts their brain to have to think at the same level that people were doing 75 years ago, whatever. Again, it's multiple generations down further, people have to think less. And so, again, I would call it a de-evolution, if you will, but it still fits the evolutionary biology book, if you will, where you're saying because of less threats, you need to have, or it's not required to have, higher levels of exceptionalism to survive. So in that, it's kind of an idiocracy where people can just become dumber and dumber and dumber, and less is required of them to pass their genes on. And so what happens is you end up with a civilization of idiots. And the other part of that, I'm not blaming it completely on that, is that there is in my opinion, an intentional effort by people who are in charge to not just reinforce, but speed up those processes in, introducing, and whether it's, I think a vast amount of it is intentional. I think some of it is unintentional, but if you're looking at things like introducing food ingredients that are just undeniably negative, like on the borderline of poison to people, introducing an educational system that essentially is created to prepare people to work in factories where you just, you sit down, you shut up, you raise your hand. I think that there are a lot of things like that where you can look back and say people have been guided in a certain direction, and because of that, again, it's a de-evolution of what is capable, or what the human total potential is. And again, there are things that we may not have used even outside of those immediate examples. Like I was just saying, there are things that we may have been able to do in our past that we have forgotten about and have become unnecessary, that we are not even able to do now. But we can see some of the death rattles, if you will, of it, where, okay, I'm able to, am I telepathically connecting with someone who is thinking of me and I'm thinking of them and they call me? Are there certain things there where it was a much stronger connection in the past that now we've de-evolved from? And again, fits in the handbook of evolutionary biology, where it's no longer necessary, but it's something that has left us weaker as a species because of it.
No, not at all.
Really?
Yeah, not at all.
What ways have people evolved?
Well, so this is part of where I'm so frustrated with my field.
Yes.
Because the thing about evolution is Darwin nailed his part of the question. We narrowed his answer to something that is too crude to be generally functional. It works for certain things. It fails to explain other things consistently. And the closer you get to human beings, the worse a job it does. Not because of anything Darwin got wrong. He was probably, to his benefit, hobbled by what he didn't know, because he didn't know the molecular part of the story. He was unconstrained by it, which forced him to speak in a general sense that turns out to be correct. But what you need to understand in order to follow how this story explains human beings is that the underlying story of evolution, the early one, pre-human story, is about genes getting into the future. That's what they do. That's what all creatures are doing. Every creature has the same purpose. Right. In creatures with meaningful culture, that is, creatures in which there's generational overlap and sociality enough for something to be transmitted outside of the genome, you get a second kind of evolution. You have cultural evolution. And in human beings, this has become it's become the central element of the story. Genes are very slow to adapt, much faster than we typically think, but nonetheless, it takes a very long time for a genetic change to spread across the human population. It takes no time at all for a cultural innovation to spread, for both better and worse.
I understand.
So what I'm arguing is that the genome, our genomes, have offloaded the evolutionary work to the layer of culture. And they've done that because culture can rapidly adapt.
Right. That makes sense.
So if you look at human beings and you expect to see a lot of evolution in the physical sense, you see distinctions between populations, but most of them are superficial. But you see radical divergence in cultural systems. Those cultural systems are equally as adaptive as the genetic systems underneath. So people often draw a distinction between biology and culture. That's a false dichotomy. Biology, or genes, and culture are equally biological. And the bitter pill that comes with the whole thing is culture is actually the genes solving a gene problem, one that we as conscious beings with values shouldn't care about. We are condemned in some sense to be playing out a battle between genes that is absurd once you see it. It's not worthy of us. So, yes, we are evolving radically. The fact that, if you go to Italy, you struggle to communicate is the result of two populations having diverged at a cultural level enough that you're functionally incompatible, right? That's a lot of evolutionary change in a short period of time. And you could say the same thing about the difference in belief systems, right? You've got effectively a phylogenetic story of evolution at the level of human cultures, right?
And I actually like his framing here less than the one that I just put forward, because the issue with this is that he's talking about something that's superficial. Like, yes, language has evolved differently in different groups of people, but that's not a changing of what we are as a group of people. So if there were physiological differences that evolved because of, I'll just provide another example. And this is going to be probably a hot topic, but if there was, say, we're selecting for a certain set of traits, like in slavery, people bred the biggest, strongest slaves that they could, because that was, if they're your workers in the field, they're going to get the most done. They can haul the most, they can do, there's all these things that they can do that are more beneficial. And now, in today's world, most of the athletes are not white. And again, this is factually accurate. No one wants to talk about it because it's uncomfortable and it's inconvenient. But if you have bred a population that's bigger and stronger and faster, and then you put them into sports where it benefits them to be bigger and faster and stronger, guess what? That group, that population is going to rise above everyone else. Same thing with, distance running. Well, people who are running across the plains of Africa, guess what? Those are going to be the people who have been, they've passed on traits over the generations of, you have survived and thrived given that you are able to traverse these long distances to get to water or whatever food sources or all these things. Well, guess what? All the best distance runners come out of Ethiopia, Kenya, like these are the places where they come from. And so the example that he's using in language is not the best example that I think that you can provide, but it's just kind of a cosmetic example. It's again, and it's very hard to have the discussions because you don't want to call it out and slavery is awful, but to deny that the U.S. was practicing eugenics essentially for the entirety of slavery in the United States is just denying fact. And again, it's an inconvenient conversation that people don't want to have, but you can see the outcomes from it today. And don't take my word for it, just look at the proportion of people who are black in sports like basketball, football, etc.
For example, we have, you have Judaism. From it evolves Christianity, right? Christianity, if in a phylogenetic sense, is the largest evolutionary branch of Judaism, right? It is a competing branch with Islam and Hinduism. These are alternative structures, and the implications for the behavior of the populations that subscribe to these different doctrines are as significant as species distinctions. In other words, the belief system that you inherit outside the genome it encodes how to be a human being relative to some niche, right? A niche that we don't describe in those terms, but we should. If we want a complete, as simple as possible story of evolution, understanding that culture alters the way evolution functions, it does not alter the objective of evolution,
right,
is the way to do it.
So just to rewind a couple of minutes, you said that genetics determine culture?
No. Genetics carve out the ability to transmit large packages of vital information about how to be outside of the genome. In other words, you inherit your genes from your parents. You inherit your culture mostly from your parents, but outside the genome. After you're born, if your parents speak Italian, you will come to speak Italian. If your parents speak Mandarin, you'll speak Mandarin. So that package of adaptive information is being passed in parallel to the genes. But again, it is...
And that's another point why I don't like the language example, is because you can learn multiple languages as well. Whereas the differences in genes, where I'm talking about de-evolution or selective breeding or any of these things, those are not things that can be obtained post-birth, right? Whereas languages, you can acquire as many as you care to try and learn. So again, that's why I don't feel like the language example is a good one.
Is unfortunately obligated to serve the ends that the genome is evolved to serve.
So you probably find yourself at about 3 a.m. turning over the deepest questions of life in your mind. What is the meaning.com/Tucker? So underlying all of this is a question, we don't need to get into this, but like, if there's no God, then how is there a moral code at all? Like, why can we say that it's better to raise a child than to kill a child? I still don't, I've never understood that. But let's just, for the sake of argument, let's just say we all agree that it's better to raise a child than to kill a child.
Yep.
And we've always agreed on that.
Yep.
From the beginning of recorded history. So for whatever reason, we all think that. There seems to be very little evidence that people are getting better. And so the Christian perspective is that people are captive to sin, to the influence of supernatural evil forces on them.
And my answer to this is, because that's the first part of his question is something that I think you hear a lot, in that, okay, well then how do you arrive at your set of morals? How do you know what is, if God is not instilling it in you, how do you know what is morally right or wrong? And that is one that has always kind of blown my mind, because again, when I asked my sister about it, that was her answer, was, religion is just a good way for a moral compass of a way to live your life. It's a set of rules. It's a good set of rules. And to me, I look at that and I'm like, it never, again, if you need that, that's great. But to me, I look at it and I say, well, I don't need that. That's why I don't practice any religion today is that I look at it and I go, I don't need that, because to me it's just intrinsic in you treat other people the way you would like to be treated. In that I feel like it's always been intrinsic in me that if I wouldn't want someone to do something to me, I wouldn't do that in turn to them. And that's the thing, is that I think evolutionarily it makes sense that these have been instilled in you, because the people who did act like, they're rude or they were crass or whatever would be ostracized from society. So there's a reinforcing nature in it where if you want to be part of the collective, if you want to move forward with the group, you have to behave in a certain way, and then parents teach their children that, and it proliferates in that way. And again, sometimes to justify that, there may be religion weaved in where, okay, this is a stronger moral framework for you for reinforcement, but I think evolutionarily it benefits you to cooperate and get along with everyone else, and it's reinforced through parenting and through experience and through as we've moved into collectives from small tribes, it has only strengthened the need to go along with that belief system, in that you need to cooperate, you need to be agreeable, you need to get along with everyone else, you need to, basically the 10 Commandments. You can't go out and kill someone, because then you would be ejected, exiled from the group, and now you're no longer reaping the benefits of the collective. So, in my opinion, it may be necessary for some people to have the extra incentive, but I think there are enough incentives biologically to want to live a moral life where you're not, for lack of a better word, pissing off everyone else in the group. Because that's the other thing, is if you wrong, it's like a tenfold thing, where if you wrong one person, well, then that's going to get out, and then the entire community is going to treat you badly. So it's not that you go out and you get a 1-for-1 of I did a negative thing and now that one person hates me. But if you do it, then no one else is going to trust you in that group. And then it's an outsized negative experience that you reap from that negative action that you took. So again, I think it's basically reinforced to be moral without necessarily needing religion in that sense. And then the second part of that is to his point of people don't seem to be getting better. That goes back to what I was saying about, yes, because of de-evolution, if you will. So it's still evolution, but it's people are getting worse because there is, and this is how it's slightly different, is that they're allowed to behave worse. So in the United States, right, you see companies acting immoral and getting away with it. There's no actual repercussions. You see politicians consistently lying, no repercussions for them. So it's, again, just to the example of you will be exiled, and you see examples of that when people behave badly. Well, now, when there's no consequences to bad behavior, well, now we're going to de-evolve, as I'll call it, to recognize that, well, then it benefits me. If I'm gaining benefit from lying and there's no negative outcome of it if I get caught, well, then why wouldn't I lie? And I think that's the issue of it, is that it's not that it is, people behaving badly and, whatever. It's because your observation is that there are no negative outcomes to behaving badly. So then why would you not behave badly? And it takes a very moral person to, in the face of that, say, I still have personal morals, And so I'm not going to act in that way. And I think that's why you see society acting worse and worse and worse, is because not many people have that, that internal moral compass, which is, again, this is where religion comes in. But there are enough people who are, you see at the top, that are acting in immoral ways, is because of that, because they're not being held accountable. You can deny claims for tens of thousands of people as a healthcare company, and there's no backlash until there is, and then, oh, oops, we are going to retract. A different healthcare company goes, oh, we're going to retract making healthcare users responsible for, this is a perfect example. I think it was Anthem, when the United Healthcare thing happened. Anthem had just put through something where the users, or the people who were buying their insurance through them, would be responsible if their doctor went over on anesthetic use, if they were using it for too long. And so as soon as the United assassination happened, oh, well, we're going to retract that immediately. And it's the same thing where they're held to account, so now they're going to act moral. And the motivating factor for that in this instance was vigilante justice, which is pathetic because it shouldn't get to that point. But when you hold these groups accountable, well, now we're not going to, dump all over the person who is, in most instances, least able to actually get the outcome that they want, except through extreme means like vigilantism. So again, I think that's why, is because in late stage capitalism that we're in, no one is held to account. And so you're going to continue to see a downward spiral, and it has nothing to do with religion at all, in my opinion. It just has to do with a lack of being held accountable.
Christian perspective is that people are captive to sin, to the influence of supernatural evil forces on them, which I think is like everyone's experience, by the way. You don't have to be a Christian to know that that's true. And we're constantly
And just another quick aside, that's why I think the saying an armed society is a polite society. Like a few years ago, I went up on an off-roading trip into the mountains and into a small little city, if you can even call it that, a little town, and everyone had guns. Everyone. And there were a few people that were with us that were acting as if they could do or say whatever they wanted, and no one would have any recourse. And the fact is, no, everyone there has guns, and if you mouth off in an extreme example where you piss someone off, well, there could be dire consequences to that. But because some of the people with us never have experienced or been around that situation, then you're going to act a fool and run your mouth, and you think nothing will happen to you. But the second that you get put in your place, well, now you're going to behave. Because is it really that big of an inconvenience that you can't bring your dog into a restaurant there? You have to sit outside on the patio. No, it's not. Well, if you are used to getting your way because you throw a fit and you can talk to a manager and you can, you get away with it, okay, that's one outcome. But if the alternative is you mouth off and you get shot, well, then you're much less likely to yell at someone about why isn't my dog allowed to come inside. That's just common sense, and kind of points to this, where there's no consequences for behaving badly.
Fighting to keep those at bay, but they reemerge, and they serially reemerge, right? Yes. And there seems to be no evidence they're going to stop reemerging. So, that's not evolution; that's stasis.
Oh, no. Again, let's just work from the other perspective. Yes. And see whether or not we arrive in the same place. Morality, as far as I can tell, is synonymous with self-sacrifice.
Correct.
That which is moral is you bypassing an evolutionary opportunity.
Exactly.
Right. So why would you do that? Why would evolution program you to bypass an evolutionary opportunity? Well, the answer is because there are competing evolutionary puzzles. So the question of, should you betray your spouse, right? Obviously, evolutionarily, it's not hard to understand the argument in favor, right? You might father a child, fathering children passes on some genes. We get why evolution might point you toward that. On the other hand, from the point of view of the well-being of your family, and your family's well-being has everything to do with how durable a position they hold in your community, how productive their lives are likely to be. The delayed benefit of not betraying your spouse is substantial, but hard to convey, right? So the religious doctrine that tells you this is how you should be, and you may see reasons not to be this way, but you can't escape the consequences of them. Those consequences will arrive, right? Again, if we go back to the question of, what happens in a community that's full of people betraying each other, well, starvation might be one thing that happens. You can describe that in terms of a God who's angry and disappointed with people, or you can describe that in game theoretic terms in which, cascades of betrayal result in lack of coordination. It amounts to the same thing.
Both are true.
And that's a good point. And then there's to the point I was making of you do one thing and then it spreads and other people view you that way too. So in this example that he's using, and it's I think it's synonymous to the one I was making. But yeah, if you cheat on your spouse and then you go and you could lie to people, but say you break up with your spouse because of it, well, now all your friends view you differently of, oh, well, he cheated on her, and although they may have your back and they're still your friends, they may look at you differently. So that's one knockoff effect. But then also when you're looking to get back in another relationship, oh, why did your previous one end? I think that's a very common question in even dating. But why did it end? And it's like, okay, well, you could lie about it, and then they find out, and then it's probably going to come to an end anyway, because your friends' wives may, when your new girlfriend comes around and they're all talking, it may come out anyway. So then you have to be honest about, well, I couldn't stay faithful. Well, then what are the odds that that's not going to negatively impact you in your future ability to find a significant other, mate, whatever, however you want to frame it, but someone else to start a relationship with? So in those instances, again, there are negative effects that you get from your indiscretions. And when you're held to account, that is why people act morally, is because you weigh the outcomes of those negative effects. And if there are no negative outcomes, then 100% in what they're saying here, you're going to act on that. And I think that's the subtext of it, is everyone's just going to act on things that they think there are no negative effects from.
But my question was not, I agree with you completely. Virtue produces rewards.
Yep.
I think that's right. And you don't have to be a Christian or a theist to believe that. My question is deeper. Why do we all assume that life is better than death? That kindness is better than cruelty? That it's better to pass on your genes than to go extinct? These are all moral judgments that seem impossible in the absence of a God.
Well, I don't think they're impossible. I just think they're incredibly cumbersome.
Well, they're arbitrary.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. You can say, well, I prefer one, but you can't say one is like absolutely better than the other. Says who?
I think there's only one of them that's arbitrary. We're way off in the weeds and all of your...
No, I think this is like central.
Okay, well good. I'm glad you do. I don't think there is a robust analytical argument for why being alive is superior to not being alive. I think this is, and mind you, I am very committed to the idea that being alive is way better.
Yeah.
That's the one I thought he was going to go with. My issue with it, though, is that I think that is the one that is the most apparent, is because, and this is another reason why I think actually religion came about, again, falls in the bucket of explaining things that we do not have an explanation for. And the added onto this is that are concerning. In that, do you want to believe that when you die, the lights go out and there's nothing? That would be a very hard concept, I think, for most people to struggle with. Because for most people, I think they enjoy being alive, right? And so the fact that it could end and everything shuts off and there's nothing is incredibly distressing. So then man creates the idea of heaven and afterlife, and you go on to bigger and better things. So to answer specifically the question of morality and being alive versus being dead, and why someone would prefer to be alive than be dead, is that I guess evolutionary biology wise, is you have a drive to, spread your lineage and continue your bloodline, and that's the goal of all creatures, right? So that's the very base level of it. But then again, at a higher level, with cognition and being sentient, then, in my opinion, the purpose of life, if you will, is to have experiences that you deem enjoyable and rewarding. And that could be, it's a very large spectrum of things that can fall under that umbrella. But to me, if you were to ask me what is the point of life, that would be it. Is you have different experiences, you learn all these different things, you experience these different things, and you find out what is the most enjoyable therein, and then you just experience as much of that as possible. You have children, you love your children, you love watching them grow, whatever. There are a bunch of different things that could be your answer to that question, but at the higher level, that is what it is. That is why everyone wants to be alive, is to go down that path of experiencing things and learning things and continuing to do things that bring them joy. So again, very, very high level, but I give you the base of, yes, to procreate and continue your line, but then also the higher level of experiences and enjoyment and pleasure in life. And so those things, I think, are why one would want to be alive and why it would be better than dying, because when you die, you don't know what happens. Everything could just shut off and it goes black. And again, that could be very distressing for people. And at the end of the day, we don't know. So that is why you'd be more incentivized to stay alive than not. And you don't need God to tell you that, in my opinion.
I'm intending to stay alive as long as possible and to help those I love do the same. So it's not that I'm confused about this, but analytically speaking, what is it about life that's superior to not life? Well, the answer is nothing, except you would expect a lot of creatures that are the product of a competition between those who were committed to living and those that weren't so committed to it. You would expect an accumulation of bias where we would all inherit the same analytical perspective, even though it's not grounded in the physical reality of the universe. So that one, the only point there is, I think that one is actually arbitrary. But once you agree that being alive is pretty great and beats the alternative, and you're going to get an infinite amount of the alternative anyway, so you might as well preserve the one space of being alive that you're going to get, right? Once you're there, well, then the answer is the rest of it follows, right? Why should you
And that's a pretty good argument that he's making right there as well, is that the finite nature of being alive is also what should make you prefer that over not being alive, being dead. Is that once you're dead, that goes on forever. And there's much more time that you will be dead than you will be alive. So the fleeting, finite nature of being alive makes it inherently more valuable than being dead. So why wouldn't you strive to maximize that and your experiences within?
Be honorable. Well, because actually it preserves your spot in the universe much better than...
I get it. But then you're back to the practical analysis of it.
Well,
right.
I mean, this is...
But we can't elide past what you described as arbitrary, because it's the root of everything.
Well, I agree. It is.
Yeah.
And I love this confusion, right? I think that being confused into thinking life is great, I mean, what else is there, right? I'm all on board with it.
It makes it difficult to... I don't understand on what basis people make judgments about, say, murder if they don't believe that there's a higher power. I just don't get that.
Well, again, I think...
And that goes back to my argument of, if you murder someone, well then all of their family, surviving family members, relatives, friends, all of them are now coming at you. So you've killed one, and now tenfold are coming back to get you. Assuming that it is found out that you are the one who committed that act. It's same thing, like eye for an eye, right? At the baseline is, if you did it and you can get away with it, well then there's no consequence, and why wouldn't you? But murder is bad because there is a high chance that there are going to be repercussions. Even if there's no law against it, there's a high chance that someone's going to come back and kill you in retribution for the person that you killed. And that's even setting aside the rules in the society in which you live, where you can have the death penalty, you can be locked up for your life, which could be viewed by some as worse than being dead. So the punitive measures that are taken against you are what will dissuade you from committing murder or the threat therein.
I think the answer is actually implied in what you asked about the failure to evolve that you see in the present. And I agree, in the present, it's pretty hard to make an argument that we are making some discernible kind of progress. In fact, we're injuring ourselves at every turn as a result of what Heather and I have called hypernovelty. The rate of change is so high that one can't figure out.
Metabolize it. No, I agree.
But the overarching pattern over time is one of a dawning of a kind of moral enlightenment. It's not, as you point out, it does not prevent the alternatives from repeatedly reemerging, right? But I mean, let's take, for example...
But how can we even call it enlightenment? Why is it not just our preference?
Let's take the story of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the story of Jesus, if I understand it, and I'm no biblical scholar, but if I understand that story, the key elements of it, or at least several key elements of it, involve a broadening of the sense of self, right? A broadening of the in-group. This is what the story of the Good Samaritan tells us, right? This is what the golden rule is. This is, love your enemy. Now, those things are a radical increase in the inclusion of others into an in-group. And the benefits of stabilizing a larger in-group are absolutely tremendous. Now, imagine for a moment that Jesus had said these things in game theoretic terms, and he had tried to convince people with whatever the equivalent of a whiteboard would have been of, the reasons to broaden the in-group at this moment in history. It's preposterous, right? It's not a good argument. Even if it's a true argument, nobody's going to get it. Nobody's going to care, right? So that's not how humans become enlightened. Humans become enlightened because of the power of a narrative that causes them to modify their behavior so that they do function more effectively in light of all of the game theoretic hazards that are always jeopardizing us. Which then answers your other question, I think. Why do the bad patterns, if it's simply good to include others in your in-group, why don't we just simply evolve to default to that and never waver? And the problem is that there's a competition between short-term gain and long-term gain. Effectively, the upgrade in which you in-group more people is much better in the long run. But in the short run, individuals who decide to take advantage of that may have some advantage inside of the group, right? And so building a structure in which you can't get away with it increases the effectiveness of the moral point, right? If you have everybody calculating that it's morally, you should do the morally right thing if you are in a position to be observed, and if you're not in a position to be observed, then you should do whatever is most profitable, right? Civilization breaks down. If, on the other hand, you take...
Which is exactly my point and exactly where I think we are today, where you see people at the top getting away with tons of stuff, and so here we are, which, again, is exactly the point I was making. And I think no amount of religion is going to fix that.
A narrative, and you say, nobody ever gets away with anything. It's being observed, it's being recorded, and it may be profitable in the short run, but there's an awful lot of punishment that will come later, right? Frankly, I don't even know if the sentence I just said is a religious narrative or a translation of game theory. It's the same thing.
Right, and I would say that everything you're saying, which is complex, quite, is an argument for a creator, because the design is so brilliant as you're describing it, and the end result, of course, is like the perpetuation of the species, of all species, that that's an accident, because you're describing a system with intent, and that intent comes from where? You're describing a system with a goal.
I am describing a system with a goal, not with intent. The system has a goal, and
the goal is the intent, right? The intent is to achieve the goal.
Well, that is the sticking point. That
this doesn't make any sense.
No, it makes a lot of
It doesn't make any sense without it. Well, I don't want to use the phrase intelligent design, but
let's take a parallel example, and
okay,
we could trip over the parallel example if
I just think you've made an amazing case for God, and I didn't know if you thought of yourself as an evangelist. But
no,
you just convinced me.
I've made a very compelling case for a belief in God.
Well, but what's the other explanation?
Well, that's just the thing. Is the other explanation is that there are processes that function. Let's take two examples.
And to answer his question is that it is, again, the way to keep everyone in line. And that's it says the carrot and the stick, right? The carrot is if you act in a positive way, then you will go to heaven, right? But if you act in a negative way, then you go to hell. And so that's a way to try and stop negative actions from happening before they happen, right? Where you're cutting it off at the pass, where you're saying, do not act in immoral ways or this will happen to you, before having to essentially demonstrate those negative effects. So, in a world without religion, it's one where I was saying is everyone's carrying a gun, and if you act up, well, now you're dead. And you have to view someone dying in order for you to understand the stick that comes with, I misbehave, I murder someone because I got angry, and now I'm getting murdered myself, and now my children learn that lesson, or my friend learns that lesson, or whatever. Versus God tells us that it's wrong to murder, and so now we just don't murder. It's essentially heading it off at the pass. And that's the argument for religion, is that if you instill it and people believe in it, then it doesn't require that feedback loop of here's the consequences of the negative action. Instead, we're gonna, hopefully you're not gonna take those negative actions because you could go to hell. And so it's kind of that thing where it's still, in my opinion, if people don't have the intrinsic moral compass like I think I do, and I'm sure other people do as well, then it's better to have the extrinsic, where it's here's your reward is heaven, here's your consequence, which is hell, if you act immorally. All right, I think that kind of covers the main argument that they make for it. There are a few other smaller discussions that they have, but it kind of tails off from there. But like I said, I find it a very interesting conversation in that I think it has been one that's been gaining momentum. I have seen multiple religious discussions across a number of different podcasts, and so I wanted to kind of take a look at this one because it is interesting in, framing things from someone who is very staunchly religious versus someone who is an evolutionary biologist. And although I think some of the approaches that he took to answering them may have not been the most sound, I think he ended up, he and I kind of end up in generally the same space. And again, my viewpoint is that of agnosticism, because I don't know, and you don't know, and no one really knows, because when the lights go off, there's no coming back and telling people. But again, I think it's just something really interesting to think about, and I think their conversation lends itself to some broader ideologies as well, which are very interesting to think about those, and are things where I could spin off entire videos on each one of those things where I kind of took a tangent off on a different topic. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you found it interesting, feel free to leave me a thumbs up. If there's any of the conversations that you'd like to have around this topic, drop it in the comments, because I would like to see what you think. And again, I think that there are tangents that I could take in here. So for future videos, if anyone leaves anything that, hey, I'd like you to talk about this, I'd like you to expand on that, because there are some where I just kind of briefly touched on it because I didn't want this video to be 5 hours long. But if you want to see future videos where I expand on any of the points that I've made here a little bit more, would be happy to do so, because again, I think it is a very interesting topic and very complex. But thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next one.